I am Skylar, 33 years old and a financial risk analyst, a profession that teaches you to anticipate every possible disaster except perhaps the one orchestrated by your own blood. Yesterday morning, my phone buzzed with an urgent banking alert that would have sent most people straight into a panic attack. It was a notification from my primary bank. My savings account, my checking account, and my emergency fund had all been completely drained. The balance staring back at me was exactly $0.00. A total of $150,000 had vanished in a matter of seconds. Before my brain could even process the missing funds, a text message flashed across my screen from my older brother Brandon. It read, "I am married tomorrow. I withdrew all the money from your bank accounts and sold the house. Bye." He actually spelled it with 4 letters. He did not ask for permission. He did not offer an apology. He simply announced that he had stolen my life savings to fund his lavish lifestyle, leaving me with absolutely nothing. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Manhattan office, looking down at the morning traffic rushing through the city streets. I did not scream. I did not break down in tears. I did the only thing that made sense in that moment. I laughed. It was a genuine, echoing laugh that startled my assistant in the hallway. Because my arrogant, narcissistic brother did not realize that stealing my money and forging my signature on a property deed was the exact mistake I had been waiting for him to make. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to watch a toxic family member dig their own grave. Trust me, you will want to hear how I handed him the shovel. I did not panic. I did not call my bank in a state of hysterics. Instead, I picked up my phone and dialed the one person my family underestimated even more than they underestimated me. His name is Andre. Andre is the brother-in-law to Melanie, my brother's incredibly obnoxious fiancée. He is also a brilliant, ruthless real estate attorney. My family completely ignored his existence at family gatherings because Andre is a black man who prefers quiet observation over loud, empty bragging. They treated him like he was just a low-level clerk. They had absolutely no idea he was a senior partner at a top-tier law firm in the city. Andre answered on the second ring. His voice was calm and intensely professional. I did not bother with pleasant greetings. I walked back to my large oak desk and said, "Brandon took the bait. He drained the accounts and he finalized the unauthorized sale of the upstate property." I could hear the satisfying sound of a heavy file closing on Andre's end of the line. He let out a low, appreciative whistle. "So he actually went through with it?" Andre asked. "He forged your signature on the grand deed." I pulled up the digital copy of the fraudulent transfer on my computer monitor. "He did," I confirmed. "He thought I was just a passive numbers girl who would roll over and cry for the sake of family peace. He sold our late grandmother's house to a shell company to fund his ridiculous over-the-top wedding with Melanie. He believes he is entitled to that property, just because he is the oldest son. I spent 3 years driving up there every single weekend to care for our grandmother while she was sick, while Brandon was busy partying in Europe and maxing out our parents' credit cards. When she passed away, she made sure the house was in my name, only to protect it from his reckless financial habits. He never forgave me for that. He always told our parents that I manipulated a dying woman, and of course they believed their precious golden boy." Andre chuckled, a deep rumbling sound over the receiver. "Well, Skylar," he said smoothly, "wire fraud across state lines and forging documents for a property sale carries a mandatory federal prison sentence, not to mention the grand larceny of the cash. Shall we proceed with the trap we set up?" I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of my computer screen. My brother had always treated me like a stepping stone, a convenient bank to fund his failures. Now he had just handed me the match to burn his fake empire to the ground. "Execute it," I told Andre, my voice dropping to a serious, calculated tone. "Transfer the legal title of the house into the Federal Historic Preservation Trust immediately. Backdate the paperwork to Tuesday exactly as we planned, using the legal loopholes. Let Brandon think he successfully sold a house he owned. Let him spend that stolen money on giant ice sculptures and imported champagne. I want him to feel like an absolute king today, because tomorrow morning the crown is going to slice his head right off. Andre laughed again. The paperwork is being filed right now, Skylar. See you at the rehearsal dinner tonight. I hung up the phone. The trap was officially set. Brandon thought he had ruined my life, but he had just signed his own arrest warrant. I grabbed my car keys and left the office, stepping into the crisp Manhattan air. The drive to my mother's house in the Connecticut suburbs usually took an hour, giving me plenty of time to process the betrayal. But as I navigated the winding roads leading to her upscale neighborhood, I felt only a cold, clinical focus. My mother, Beatrice, lived in a sprawling colonial house that my father had left her. It was a monument to her vanity, filled with expensive rugs and pristine furniture that nobody was allowed to sit on. I parked in the driveway and let myself in through the front door. I found Beatrice in the sunroom, lounging on a white linen sofa. She was casually sipping a glass of expensive red wine, looking completely undisturbed. She did not even flinch when I walked into the room. "Hello, Skylar," she said smoothly, not bothering to look up from her lifestyle magazine. "I suppose you saw the bank notification. Try not to make a scene. I just had these carpets professionally cleaned." I stood in the doorway, studying the woman who had brought me into the world. "You knew," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "You knew Brandon emptied my accounts and forged the deed to the upstate house." Beatrice took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine. She set the glass down on a crystal coaster and finally looked at me with an expression of mild annoyance. "Oh, please stop being so dramatic, Skylar. He did not forge anything. He merely expedited a transaction that was going to happen eventually. He is the oldest son. He is the man of the family now. He needs this wedding to secure Melanie's wealthy social circle. You have a good job in the city. You are single. You will make the money back." I stared at her, absorbing the sheer audacity of her justification. "He stole $150,000, mother. That is not a loan. That is grand larceny. And selling a house that legally belongs to me is property fraud." Beatrice waved her hand dismissively, as if I were a child complaining about a stolen toy. "Family money is family money," she replied coldly. "You were always so selfish with your grandmother. You hoarded that house when you knew your brother needed capital to launch his life. Melanie's parents are flying in from Europe. Do you expect your brother to marry her in a cheap banquet hall?" A sudden realization hit me. I am a financial risk analyst. I know the security protocols of my bank. Brandon is notoriously terrible with technology and paperwork. He could not have bypassed the two-factor authentication on my accounts by himself. He would have needed my social security number, the answers to my security questions, and my mother's maiden name. "How did he get into my accounts?" I asked, my tone dropping to a whisper. Beatrice actually smiled, a proud, sickening little smile. "I gave him your file," she admitted without a shred of guilt. "The blue folder you left in my safe 2 years ago when you went on that business trip to Japan. It had your social security number, your passwords, and your banking details. I told him to take what he needed. Consider it your contribution to the family legacy." The silence in the sunroom was deafening. My own mother had handed over my identity to a thief so he could buy ice sculptures and designer tuxedos. She had actively participated in a federal crime just to maintain the illusion of her golden boy's success. For a brief second, she looked at my face, perhaps expecting to see tears or hear me screaming. She was waiting for the emotional breakdown she had punished me for during my entire childhood. But the tears never came. Instead, a profound sense of liberation washed over me. Any lingering guilt I had about destroying my brother completely vanished because now I knew exactly who else was going down with him. Beatrice had just confessed to conspiracy to commit wire fraud and identity theft. "I see," I said softly. "Well, thank you for clarifying that for me, Mother." Beatrice picked up her magazine again, looking bored. "Good. Now go home and find something presentable to wear for the rehearsal dinner tonight. Melanie wants everyone in pastel colors. Do not embarrass us." I turned around and walked out of the sunroom without another word. I did not slam the front door on my way out. I simply pulled it shut with a quiet click. As I walked back to my car, I pulled out my phone and sent a quick text message to Andre. It read, "Add Beatrice to the lawsuit. She provided the social security number and passwords. She is an accomplice to the wire fraud." Andre replied a second later, "Roger that. The net just got wider." I started my engine and drove away from my childhood home, leaving my mother to her wine and her magazines. She thought she had sacrificed me to protect Brandon. She had no idea she had just thrown herself onto the sinking ship. Tonight at the rehearsal dinner, I was going to smile, eat their expensive food, and watch them celebrate with stolen money. The countdown had officially begun. When I arrived back at my apartment, my phone was vibrating so aggressively it practically danced across my kitchen counter. I picked it up and found my notification screen completely flooded. Dozens of alerts from Instagram were pouring in, accompanied by text messages from distant relatives and high school friends I had not spoken to in years. I unlocked the screen and opened the app. Right at the top of my feed was a newly posted photo album from Melanie. It was a lavish, over-the-top pre-wedding photo shoot. In the main picture, Brandon and Melanie were standing on the balcony of a luxury hotel, dressed in designer clothes holding crystal flutes of champagne. They looked like royalty, completely unbothered by the fact that their entire aesthetic was funded by a felony, but it was the caption that made my blood run cold. Melanie had written, "So incredibly grateful for my amazing little sister Skylar. She finally learned to put family first," and gifted us the money for our dream wedding. "We are so blessed to have a sister who knows her place and supports her brother's future. Hashtag family first. Hashtag blessed." She had tagged me directly. They were publicly parading my stolen life savings as a voluntary gift. The text messages from relatives were equally infuriating. My Aunt Patricia wrote, "I am so proud of you for growing up and sharing your inheritance. You really are a saint." A former college roommate messaged, "Wow, Skylar paying for their whole wedding is incredibly generous." Brandon and Melanie were trying to trap me in a public relations nightmare. They figured if they announced to the entire world that I gave them the money willingly, I would be too embarrassed to publicly dispute it and ruin their perfect weekend. They wanted to weaponize my own reputation against me. I did not leave an angry comment. I did not report the post. I simply took a screenshot of the caption and saved it to my evidence folder. Let them build their pedestal as high as possible. The higher they climbed, the more bones they would break when the foundation collapsed. I sat down at my kitchen island and flipped open my laptop. It was time to pull the trigger on the real trap. I initiated a secure video call with Andre. He answered immediately, sitting in his sleek downtown office with a stack of heavily stamped documents on his desk. "Did you see the Instagram post?" I asked him, pouring myself a glass of sparkling water. Andre chuckled, shaking his head. "I saw it. Melanie's sister has been talking about it all morning. They are really pushing the generous sister narrative. It is quite the strategy. Let them have their likes and comments," I said, opening my encrypted email portal. "Are the final transfer documents ready?" Andre held up a thick manila folder, fully prepared and legally bulletproof. "As we discussed, your grandmother's house was built in the early 1900s and has original architectural features. I contacted a colleague at the Federal Historic Preservation Trust. They were more than happy to accept the property as a charitable donation. Because I was the sole legal owner of the property, I had the right to donate it. Andre had drafted the paperwork to transfer the title completely out of my name and into the hands of the federal government. But the true genius of Andre's strategy was in the timing. Through a series of perfectly legal administrative filings, the transfer of ownership was backdated to Tuesday. Brandon had forged my signature and sold the property to his shady buyers on Thursday. "You understand what this means?" Andre asked, his eyes gleaming with professional satisfaction. "When Brandon sold that house, he did not sell your property. By the time his forged deed was filed, the house belonged to the federal government. He illegally sold federal property to a private investment group. That elevates his little scam from local real estate fraud to a high-level federal offense." I smiled, typing in my digital signature on the final authorization forms. And because he used the internet and cell phones to coordinate the sale and transfer the funds that adds wire fraud to the charges. Exactly, Andre confirmed. The buyers he sold it to are actually a limited liability company I know well. They cooperate with federal agents on real estate scams. Brandon thinks he deposited clean money from a private buyer. He actually deposited tracked funds from a federal sting operation. The moment he swipes that debit card to pay for his wedding catering, he is laundering money. I hit submit on the document. The screen flashed green, confirming the transfer was complete. I no longer owned the house. I had no money in my bank accounts. On paper, I was completely broke. But in reality, I held the detonator to Brandon's entire life. I will see you tonight at the rehearsal dinner, Andre, I said, closing the laptop. Wear something nice, Skylar, he replied with a grin. We have a show to put on. I walked into my bedroom and looked at the dress I had chosen for the evening. It was a simple, understated navy blue dress, exactly the kind of boring outfit my mother expected me to wear. I slipped it on, applied a light layer of makeup, and practiced my best supportive sister smile in the mirror. Tonight, I was going to let Brandon play the king of the world. I was going to let him insult me, belittle me, and flaunt his stolen wealth. Because every single dollar he spent was another nail in his meticulously crafted coffin. The rehearsal dinner was held at an exclusive waterfront restaurant in Brooklyn, a place requiring a 6-month waiting list and a massive non-refundable deposit. Walking into the private dining room, I was hit by the scent of white truffles and thousands of dollars worth of rare orchids. Brandon was standing by the private bar holding a custom-engraved glass of single malt scotch. He wore a tuxedo that cost more than my first car. My mother, Beatrice, held court near the centerpieces draped in heavy silk. Seeing me, her fake camera-ready smile completely vanished. She looked me up and down, her eyes narrowing in disgust. "Oh, Skylar," Beatrice said, her voice silencing nearby conversations. "You actually wore that. I specifically told you pastel colors. You look like you are going to a corporate funeral. Did you find that on the clearance rack?" Brandon walked over, swirling his scotch. He let out a loud, obnoxious laugh. "Cut her some slack, mother," Brandon sneered. "She has a strict budget. We cannot all afford to dress like royalty. Besides, she is just an analyst. They are practically trained to fade into the background. Let her hide in her little navy dress." I smiled warmly, sipping from my glass of sparkling water. "It is comfortable," I replied evenly. "And you are right, Brandon. I do prefer to stay in the background and watch how things unfold. You never know what you might see when people think nobody is looking." Brandon rolled his eyes, missing the threat in my words. Just then, the heavy oak doors of the dining room opened again. Melanie walked in, practically sparkling in a silver designer gown, followed closely by her older sister, Nicole, and Nicole's husband, Andre. Andre looked incredibly sharp in a tailored charcoal suit. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who commanded boardrooms on a daily basis. But in this room to my family, he was just an outsider. As a black man married into Melanie's white status-obsessed family, they never let him forget his supposed place. Brandon immediately puffed out his chest and walked over to intercept them. He hugged Melanie, then offered Andre a stiff, condescending pat on the shoulder. "Andre, good to see you made it," Brandon said, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. "Did you have to take the subway all the way from downtown? I know parking around here is $50 a pop. I can validate your ticket if things are tight this month." Still pushing papers at that little legal aid clinic. Nicole stiffened, her face flushing with anger, but Andre gently placed a hand on her lower back to calm her. He did not break eye contact with my brother. His expression remained incredibly pleasant, completely unbothered by the racial microaggressions and blatant disrespect. "I appreciate the offer," Brandon, Andre said smoothly, "but the firm handles my transportation. And yes, I am still heavily involved in the legal field. We have been doing a lot of interesting work with federal property transfers lately. It keeps me quite busy." Brandon laughed, clearly not understanding a single word Andre had just said. Right, well, just do not bore my guests with legal jargon tonight. This is a celebration of success and wealth. Try to keep up. Brandon patted Andre on the shoulder one more time and walked away to greet a group of groomsmen. Andre caught my eye across the room. He raised his glass of water slightly in my direction, a silent toast between the two architects of Brandon's upcoming destruction. Nobody in that room realized that the man they were treating like a glorified intern was actually the senior partner at the exact law firm currently holding the deed to the property Brandon had just illegally sold. Andre was not just pushing papers. He was currently directing a federal investigation that had Brandon's name right at the very top of the indictment list. I walked over to the appetizer table. My mother glided past me, whispering harshly under her breath. Try to mingle with people who actually matter, Skylar. Do not spend all night talking to Melanie's charity cases. I savored the delicious irony. I will be sure to remember that, Mother, I said quietly. I am only interested in talking to the people who hold the real power in this room. Beatrice smirked, thinking I had finally agreed with her twisted worldview. She walked away completely unaware that she had just insulted the one man who could have potentially negotiated her a plea deal. The dinner was proceeding exactly as planned. Brandon and Beatrice were entirely drunk on their own arrogance, blindly throwing insults at the executioner, while their heads were already resting on the chopping block. I waited for the perfect moment. It came halfway through the second course of roasted sea bass, when Brandon abruptly pushed his chair back, excused himself from the head table, and walked toward the private restrooms down the hall. This was my window. I slipped my phone out of my evening clutch, opened the voice memo application, and hit the red record button. I locked the screen and slid the phone deep into the hidden pocket of my navy dress. It was time to give the performance of a lifetime. I followed him into the long, dimly lit hallway. The heavy velvet curtains lining the walls completely muffled the sound of the clinking crystal glasses and the booming laughter from the main dining room. I took a deep, calculated breath, forced my shoulders to slump forward, and completely altered my breathing pattern. By the time Brandon stepped out of the restroom, wiping his hands on a monogram towel, I was leaning heavily against the textured wallpaper. I clutched my chest with both hands and actively hyperventilated, letting out short, ragged gasps. Brandon stopped dead in his tracks, adjusting his expensive silk tie. He looked at me not with an ounce of brotherly concern, but with profound, unfiltered annoyance. "What is wrong with you now?" he sighed, checking his luxury watch, as if my presence was a massive inconvenience to his schedule. "You are hyperventilating like a dying fish." I forced my voice to crack, letting out a pathetic, trembling sob. "Brandon, please," I gasped, reaching out and grabbing the sleeve of his tuxedo jacket. "I am having a massive panic attack. I just checked my banking app again. My rent is automatically drafted tomorrow morning and my account is completely overdrawn. You took everything." He pulled his arm away, forcefully brushing off his sleeve as if I had physically contaminated him. "Keep your voice down," he hissed, glancing nervously around the empty hallway. "Important people are trying to eat in there." I leaned in closer, making absolutely sure the microphone hidden in my pocket picked up every single syllable of our conversation. "You emptied $150,000 from my accounts this morning," I whispered frantically, injecting real tears into my eyes. "You sold Grandma's house. I have absolutely $0 to my name right now. I just need $2,000 to cover my rent so I do not get evicted next week. Please, Brandon, consider it a loan out of my own money. Just $2,000. I needed him to confirm the theft out loud. I needed him to acknowledge the exact financial amount and his deliberate, premeditated action. Brandon let out a sharp, cruel laugh. He leaned back against the opposite wall, thoroughly enjoying my manufactured misery. "A loan out of your own money," he mocked, shaking his head. "Let us get something straight right now, Skylar. That was family money. You were just holding on to it because Grandma was delusional at the end. I needed it to secure a wedding venue that does not smell like cheap bleach. You think Melanie's parents want to sit in a drafty barn? You think my future clients are going to trust a financial broker who gets married at a public park? I did what I had to do to protect the family image. But my rent, I pleaded, letting a tear roll down my cheek. How am I supposed to live? You stole my entire life savings. I did not steal it. I reallocated it to a better cause, he snapped arrogantly. His voice was loud, crisp, and perfectly captured by my hidden device. He reached inside his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a thick silver money clip holding a massive stack of crisp bills. He slowly peeled off a single $100 bill. He looked at the bill, looked down at my tear-stained face, and simply crumpled the money into a tight ball. He flicked it directly at my chest. It hit my collarbone and bounced onto the expensive carpet. "Take an Uber home, Skylar," he sneered, stepping right over the crumpled bill. "Go cry in your cheap apartment. Take a sleeping pill. Do whatever you have to do, but do not ruin my vibe tonight. I am the man of the hour, and you are acting like a desperate beggar. Fix your face before you walk back into that room, or do not walk back in at all." He turned his back on me and strode confidently down the hallway, whistling a cheerful tune as he pushed the heavy oak doors open and rejoined his luxury party. The moment the doors swung shut, my trembling stopped instantly. My breathing returned to a slow, measured, and perfectly calm rhythm. I stood up straight, brushing imaginary dust off my dress. I looked down at the crumpled $100 bill resting on the carpet. I slowly bent down, picked it up, and smoothed out the creases. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and pressed stop on the recording. I played back the last 30 seconds. The audio was crystal clear. His mocking tone, his blatant admission of stealing my $150,000, and his complete lack of remorse were all permanently digitized. In a court of law, proving malicious intent can sometimes be tricky because defense attorneys love to argue clerical errors. But Brandon had just handed me an airtight, undeniable confession wrapped up in a bow of breathtaking arrogance. I smiled, sliding the $100 bill and the phone back into my pocket. "Thank you for the Uber money, Brandon," I whispered to the empty hallway. "But you are going to need it a lot more than I do." I walked back into the main dining room, plastering a perfectly bland smile back onto my face. The waiters were clearing the appetizer plates and bringing out the main courses. I took my seat next to my mother, sliding my clutch onto the table. Across from me, Melanie was aggressively swirling her champagne. She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto my small bag, with the intensity of a hawk spotting prey. "Skylar." Melanie began, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Your mother mentioned you brought your grandmother's vintage diamond necklace with you tonight. She said you took it out of the bank vault because you did not trust the security at your cheap apartment." I kept my expression entirely neutral. "That is correct," I replied calmly. "It is in my purse. I am taking it back to the bank first thing on Monday morning." Melanie clapped her hands together, flashing a bright, predatory smile. "Oh, that is absolutely perfect. I have been looking everywhere for my something old for the ceremony tomorrow. My dress has a plunging neckline, and those diamonds will sit flawlessly on my collarbone. Hand it over so I can try it on with my rehearsal dress." I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. "No," I said flatly. The table suddenly went completely silent. Brandon stopped chewing his food. Melanie's smile froze, turning into a tight, angry line. "Excuse me," she snapped. I said no. I repeated, making sure my voice carried over the ambient music. "It is a fragile family heirloom. It is not a costume piece to be passed around for photo opportunities. It belongs to me, and it is staying in my possession." My mother slammed her wine glass onto the table, the dark red liquid splashing over the rim. "Skylar, stop being so incredibly selfish," Beatrice hissed. "Melanie is about to become your sister. She is family. The least you can do after ruining the mood earlier is let her wear a piece of jewelry for a few hours. Do not embarrass us in front of the guests." I looked directly into my mother's eyes. "I am not embarrassing anyone, Mother. I am simply protecting my property. The answer is absolutely not." I turned my attention back to my dinner, ignoring the furious glares burning into the side of my head. The tension at the table was thick enough to cut with a steak knife. A few minutes later, the waiter brought out the dessert course. I stood up from my chair. "Excuse me," I announced quietly to no one in particular. I need to use the restroom to freshen up my lipstick. I deliberately left my navy blue clutch sitting right on my chair, partially hidden under my napkin. It was a calculated risk, but a necessary one. I knew my mother possessed absolutely zero boundaries, especially when she felt her authority had been challenged. I walked to the lavish marble restroom, taking my time to wash my hands and reapply my makeup. I stood in front of the mirror, counting slowly to 120. That was exactly 2 minutes. More than enough time for a desperate woman to commit a petty crime. When I returned to the dining room, the atmosphere at the table had completely shifted. The heavy tension was gone. Melanie was giggling softly, whispering into Brandon's ear. My mother was sipping her wine, looking incredibly pleased with herself. I pulled out my chair and sat down. I immediately noticed that my napkin had been shifted. I reached under it and picked up my clutch. It was significantly lighter. The brass clasp was not fully clicked shut. I opened the bag and peered inside. The heavy black velvet pouch containing the vintage diamond necklace was completely gone. I looked across the table. Melanie caught my eye and offered a smug, victorious little smirk. She patted the side of her designer handbag, a silent taunt letting me know exactly who had won the battle. My mother refused to look in my direction, suddenly very interested in her slice of chocolate cake. They actually thought they had outsmarted me. They thought I would throw a massive tantrum, create a scene, and give them the perfect excuse to kick me out of the dinner and paint me as the crazy, jealous sister. I did not say a single word. I did not demand they search Melanie's bag. I simply closed my clutch, picked up my dessert fork, and took a bite of my cake. It tasted absolutely delicious. What they did not know was that I never trusted my family around anything valuable. Before I even left my apartment that evening, I had carefully sliced open the inner lining of that black velvet pouch. I had slipped a tiny electronic tracking device deep inside the fabric and stitched it back up with invisible thread. Under the table, I pulled my cell phone out of my pocket. I opened my digital tracking application and watched the little green dot blinking brightly on the screen. The device was active, broadcasting its exact location directly to my phone. Let Melanie enjoy her stolen victory for the night. Stealing family heirlooms was just another charge to add to the growing list of their criminal activities. The rehearsal dinner finally dragged to a close around midnight. Guests began filtering out of the private dining room, calling for their valet-parked cars and exchanging exaggerated air kisses. I said my polite goodbyes, playing the role of the defeated younger sister to perfection. Brandon and Melanie strutted out to their rented limousine, completely intoxicated by their own perceived brilliance. I walked to my modest sedan, got inside, and immediately locked the doors. I pulled my phone back out and opened the tracking application. I fully expected the blinking green dot to travel straight to the 5-star luxury hotel where Brandon and Melanie had booked the presidential bridal suite. But as I watched the map interface, the dot took a sudden sharp detour. It was moving away from the upscale downtown district and heading toward an industrial neighborhood known for late-night cash exchange businesses. Melanie was not in that car. She had posted an Instagram story 2 minutes ago from the hotel lobby with her bridesmaids. That meant Brandon had taken the necklace. I started my engine and followed the digital trail at a safe distance. 20 minutes later, the green dot stopped moving. I pulled my car into a dark alleyway and peered through my windshield. Brandon's rented limousine was idling on the curb in front of a neon sign that read 24-hour pawn and gold exchange. I watched in absolute fascination as my brother, dressed in his custom tuxedo, hurried out of the pawn shop, clutching a thick white envelope. He looked pale, frantic, and sweating profusely. He had not stolen the diamond necklace for Melanie to wear at the wedding. He had stolen it to pawn for fast cash. This made absolutely no logical sense. Brandon had just stolen $150,000 from my bank accounts that very morning. Even with the exorbitant wedding expenses, he should have had tens of thousands in liquid cash remaining. Why was he desperately pawning stolen family jewelry in the middle of the night? I needed answers, and I knew exactly where to find them. I drove straight back to my apartment, brewed a strong pot of black coffee, and sat down at my multiple monitor workstation. As a financial risk analyst, I deal with complex security systems every single day. Bypassing the basic firewall on my mother's home network, where Brandon kept his primary desktop computer logged in, took me less than 4 minutes. I established a remote connection to his shared family computer and began digging through his digital footprint. I bypassed his embarrassingly simple passwords and went straight into his financial folders. I expected to find overpaid vendor invoices or maybe a secret gambling debt. What I found was infinitely worse and vastly more pathetic. I opened his hidden cryptocurrency exchange portfolio. The screen populated with a barrage of red downward arrows. I ran a quick forensic trace on the transaction history, matching the timestamps to the exact moment he had drained my bank accounts. He had not simply transferred my $150,000 to a wedding planner. He had transferred a massive chunk of it, exactly $100,000, into a high-risk crypto trading account. Brandon thought he was a financial genius. He had used my stolen money to day trade volatile meme coins on maximum margin, genuinely believing he could double the money in a few hours, pay for the wedding, and keep the leftover profits for himself. Instead, the market had violently crashed. His over-leveraged positions were instantly liquidated by the trading platform. I watched the digital ledger confirm the brutal reality. $100,000 completely wiped out in less than 45 minutes. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, letting out a low breath. Brandon was not just a thief. He was completely broke. The money clip he had flashed at me in the hallway, the cash he just got from pawning my grandmother's necklace, that was likely the very last of his liquid funds. He was desperately trying to patch the sinking hull of his financial ship before Melanie found out. Melanie was a woman who expected private jets, designer wardrobes, and a billionaire lifestyle. If she knew her future husband had just gambled away his stolen safety net on internet joke currency, she would cancel the wedding and leave him stranded at the altar without a second thought. A slow, dangerous smile crept across my face. Brandon was backed into a corner, completely blinded by panic and ego. Desperate men are predictable. They always look for a quick fix, a magical lifeline to save them from their own stupidity. I opened a blank document on my computer. It was time to give my brother exactly what he was looking for, a golden opportunity that would finally snap the trap completely shut. I began typing. As a risk analyst, my daily job involves predicting market movements based on confidential corporate data. I know exactly what an internal insider trading memo looks like. I created a document bearing the official letterhead of my financial firm. I labeled it strictly confidential and for senior partners only. The memo detailed an impending acquisition of a small, practically worthless biotechnology company. According to my fabricated report, this company was secretly being bought out by a massive pharmaceutical giant at exactly noon the following day. I projected that the stock price would surge by over 800% the moment the market digested the news. I printed the fake memo, slipped it into a red security folder, and stamped it with a highly sensitive watermark. It looked incredibly authentic. It was the ultimate bait for a desperate man addicted to easy money. Early the next morning, the day of the wedding, I drove back to my mother's house. The sprawling colonial was buzzing with chaotic energy. Caterers were dropping off breakfast platters, groomsmen were running around looking for their matching ties, and my mother was barking orders at floral delivery drivers. Brandon was standing in the kitchen pouring himself a massive cup of black coffee. He looked exhausted, the heavy bags under his eyes betraying his massive financial ruin from the night before. I walked into the kitchen holding the red folder tightly to my chest. I poured myself a cup of coffee and set the folder down on the marble island right next to Brandon's elbow. Then I pulled out my phone and held it to my ear, pretending to answer an urgent incoming call. "Yes, Mr. Sterling?" I said, making my voice sound breathless and panicked. "Yes, I have the biotech acquisition file with me. I know it is highly classified. No one has seen it. I am going to lock it in my car right now. I will be right there." I set my coffee mug down intentionally, leaving the red folder sitting completely unguarded on the counter. I turned my back to Brandon and rushed out into the hallway, pretending to continue my frantic phone conversation. From the hallway, I pulled out my secondary phone and accessed the home security camera system I had hacked into the night before. I watched the live feed from the kitchen. Brandon stared at the red folder. He looked around the room to make sure no one was watching. His hand hovered over the confidential seal. Human greed is an incredibly predictable metric. A drowning man will grab onto a razor blade if he thinks it is a life preserver. Brandon opened the folder and read the fake memo. I watched his eyes widen. His posture completely changed. He pulled out his cell phone and snapped several pictures of the document, his hands shaking with excitement. He then closed the folder and stepped away right before I walked back into the kitchen, grabbed the folder, and feigned a massive sigh of relief. I took the folder out to my car, but I kept my eyes glued to my monitoring software. Brandon had the insider tip, but he had a massive problem. He had no liquid cash left to invest. His bank accounts were empty, and his credit cards were completely maxed out. If he wanted to capitalize on this fake 800% surge, he needed capital immediately. Sitting in my car, I watched his web traffic route through the dark browser on his phone. He was not logging into a traditional bank. He was accessing an encrypted messaging application. He was contacting a shadow lender. This was a notoriously dangerous private lending syndicate that catered to desperate gamblers and failing brokers. They did not check credit scores, and they did not care about your debt-to-income ratio. They operated strictly on collateral and intimidation. I watched the digital transaction unfold on my screen. Brandon was requesting a short-term loan of $50,000. To secure the funds instantly, he uploaded the fraudulent property deed from my grandmother's house as collateral, along with his own professional brokerage license. The shadow lender approved the transfer within 10 minutes. The $50,000 hit Brandon's empty trading account. He immediately used every single penny to buy shares of the worthless biotechnology company I had highlighted in the fake memo. He thought he was about to make $400,000 by lunchtime. He thought he was going to save his wedding pay, back the loan, and prove he was a financial genius. Instead, he had just borrowed $50,000 from violent criminals to buy stock in a company that was quietly filing for bankruptcy. He had driven the final nail into his own coffin, and he had done it using the very hammer I handed him. I stepped out of my car and walked back into the bustling colonial house. The kitchen was a chaotic war zone of floral arrangements and nervous bridesmaids. I grabbed my coffee mug and leaned against the counter, waiting for the explosion. Right on schedule, the heavy wooden front door swung open. A man in a sharp black suit, holding a digital tablet, walked into the foyer. He was the head coordinator for the luxury catering company. Brandon, the coordinator, called out, his voice cutting through the chatter. "We have our refrigerated trucks parked out front, but my corporate office just flagged our account system. We need the final $15,000 payment processed immediately before my crew can start unloading the ice sculptures and seafood stations. Our contract states no setup begins without final clearance." Brandon puffed out his chest. "No problem at all," he said arrogantly. He pulled out his premium black credit card and handed it over. "Put it on there." The coordinator pulled a mobile card reader from his pocket and inserted the chip. A harsh red light blinked on the screen, accompanied by a loud beep. "Declined." Brandon frowned. "Swipe it again. The chip is probably just dirty." The coordinator swiped the magnetic strip. The machine beeped aggressively again. "Still declined. Insufficient funds." Brandon's face dropped. His confident posture vanished instantly. He frantically pulled out a second card. Declined. He tried a third card. Declined. The massive crypto crash the night before had wiped out his stolen cash, and his credit lines were completely maxed out to the limit. He had absolutely zero purchasing power left. Panic set in, overriding his common sense. Brandon spun around and pointed a trembling finger directly at me across the kitchen. "You did this," he screamed, his face turning a blotchy red. "You locked my cards. You called the bank and reported fraud on the family accounts to freeze me out, did you not?" The entire room fell dead silent. The bridesmaids stopped applying their makeup. The catering coordinator looked incredibly uncomfortable. I leaned back against the counter, holding my coffee mug with both hands. I spoke in a clear, perfectly calm voice. I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about, Brandon. I do not have access to your personal credit cards. You liar, he yelled, taking a threatening step toward me. You hacked my accounts. Unlock it right now, or I swear I will destroy you. I turned my attention to the catering coordinator. Sir, you can check the names on those credit cards. My name is Skylar. I have zero legal authority over his financial accounts. If his cards are declining, it is because he is completely out of money. I am just a guest here. The coordinator examined the plastic cards and nodded firmly. She is right, sir. These are in your name only. If you cannot provide a valid form of payment within the next 5 minutes, I have strict orders to pull my team and cancel the catering service. Suddenly, Melanie's sharp voice echoed from the top of the grand staircase. Cancel the catering! What is going on down there, Brandon? Brandon froze, the blood completely drained from his face. If Melanie found out the truth right now, she would walk right out the door. My mother. Beatrice rushed into the foyer. Her perfect blowout was slightly frizzy and she was sweating profusely. Nobody is canceling anything, Beatrice declared, her voice trembling slightly. It is just a temporary fraud hold from the bank due to the large volume of wedding transactions. I will cover it. Beatrice walked over to the antique writing desk in the corner. She pulled out her personal leather checkbook. Her hand was shaking so badly she could barely hold the pen steady. I watched her with intense analytical fascination. I knew exactly what my mother's financial situation looked like. She lived completely off my father's dwindling life insurance policy and the credit lines Brandon usually paid for her. She did not have $15,000 in liquid cash sitting in her checking account. She was deliberately writing a bad check to temporarily appease the caterer and save Brandon's wedding from imploding. She ripped the check from the booklet and shoved it into the coordinator's hand. Here, deposit this on Monday morning. Now please get those trucks unloaded. The bride is getting anxious. The coordinator examined the check, shrugged indifferently, and walked out the front door. Beatrice turned around and glared at me with absolute venom. I hope you are happy, Skylar, causing a massive scene on your brother's most important day. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I am just standing here, Mother. I did not make his credit cards decline. Brandon stormed past me, violently bumping my shoulder as he headed for the stairs. He was sweating right through his shirt. The first major domino had officially fallen. My mother had just committed check fraud to cover for a man who was already under federal investigation for wire fraud. They were digging a hole so deep that neither of them would ever see the light of day again. And the wedding ceremony was still 3 hours away. I gave the chaotic kitchen one last look before quietly slipping out the front door. The caterers were busy hauling giant ice sculptures and expensive seafood stations out of their refrigerated trucks, completely unaware that the check securing their services was entirely worthless. I got into my car and drove away from my mother's upscale suburban neighborhood. I had a very important meeting to attend, and it was not a bridal brunch. I navigated toward a quiet, high-end coffee shop located in the downtown district, exactly halfway between the house and the luxury wedding venue. Andre was already sitting at a secluded corner booth when I arrived. He looked immaculate in a tailored dark navy suit, blending in perfectly with the morning business crowd. In front of him sat 2 steaming cups of black coffee and a thick leather briefcase. I slid into the booth opposite him, feeling a sudden surge of adrenaline. There was absolutely no trace of the condescending family dynamic here. In this setting, Andre was a ruthless legal shark, and we were reviewing our final kill strategy. "Good morning, Skylar," Andre said smoothly, sliding one of the coffee cups toward me. "I trust the morning preparations are going exactly as disastrously as we predicted." I took a sip of the dark roast and smiled. My mother just committed check fraud to pay the caterers because Brandon's credit cards all declined. He is completely tapped out from his little crypto adventure last night. Andre chuckled, flipping open his laptop. "Well, let us add that to the growing mountain of evidence." He turned the screen toward me, displaying a series of encrypted escrow files and bank transfer confirmations. Take a close look at the buyer profile for your grandmother's property, Andre instructed, tapping a manicured finger on the screen. Brandon thought he was selling the house to a naive, fast cash real estate investment group called Apex Holdings, LLC. He thought they were just careless private investors who would not properly vet the title history until after the money cleared the bank. I scanned the documents. The corporate structure of Apex Holdings looked incredibly complex. It is a front, Andre explained, his voice dropping to a confidential volume. Apex Holdings is a shell corporation operated directly by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I raised my eyebrows in genuine surprise. You sold him out to a federal sting operation. Andre nodded, his eyes gleaming with professional satisfaction. I have colleagues who specialize in prosecuting high-level real estate syndicates. When I tipped them off that Brandon was using fraudulent credentials to initiate an unauthorized property transfer, they eagerly stepped in as the buyers. Brandon did not just forge a local deed. He transmitted forged financial documents across state lines to federal agents. Because the funds were wired from a bank in New York to his personal account in Connecticut, it immediately triggered the Interstate Commerce Clause. That elevates the crime to federal wire fraud. Each count carries a maximum sentence of 20 years in federal prison. And because we transferred the legal title of the house to the Historic Preservation Trust on Tuesday, the property technically belonged to the United States government when Brandon executed the sale on Thursday. I let the magnitude of the situation wash over me. He stole from the government, I said softly. Andre took a sip of his coffee. He stole from the federal government, he laundered the money through his offshore crypto accounts, and he directly defrauded federal agents. The escrow company flagged the title discrepancy early this morning. The agents allowed the wire transfer to fully process just to secure the final piece of undeniable proof. The crime is now officially complete, legally binding, and completely irreversible. Andre's cell phone buzzed loudly on the table. He glanced at the screen and offered a sharp, dangerous smile. That was my contact at the Bureau. The arrest warrants have been officially signed by a federal judge. They are moving tactical units into position around the church right now. Brandon thinks he is walking down the aisle to secure a wealthy bride and a lifetime of luxury. In reality, he is walking straight into a maximum security federal penitentiary. I closed the laptop and handed it back to Andre. I finished my coffee, feeling a profound sense of closure. All my life, my family had protected Brandon from the consequences of his own reckless actions. They had sacrificed my happiness, my financial security, and my boundaries to build a protective fortress around their golden child. But federal prosecutors do not care about toxic family dynamics. They do not care about my mother's endless excuses. Let us head to the church, I said, standing up from the leather booth. I need to get fitted for my bridesmaid dress. I want to look my absolute best when the FBI crashes the wedding photos. Andre packed up his briefcase, his expression perfectly stoic. Lead the way, Skylar. Let us go watch the Empire fall. The drive to the historic cathedral took less than 20 minutes. The venue was an absolute masterpiece of Gothic architecture featuring massive stained glass windows and towering vaulted ceilings. It was exactly the kind of ostentatious display of wealth my brother craved. I walked through the heavy iron doors and navigated the labyrinth of corridors toward the bridal wing to find my designated dressing room. As I walked past the groom's suite, I noticed the heavy oak door was cracked wide open. I paused in the shadows of the hallway, perfectly hidden from view, and watched my brother. Brandon was standing on a small wooden pedestal in the center of the lavishly decorated room. A highly paid bespoke Italian tailor was kneeling at his feet, carefully pinning the hem of his custom tuxedo pants. Brandon was holding a heavy crystal glass of expensive bourbon, desperately trying to project the image of a wealthy, unbothered patriarch. But his body language told a completely different story. His knee was bouncing with frantic energy. He was sweating despite the aggressive air conditioning. He kept checking his luxury wristwatch every 10 seconds. It was 11:55 in the morning. He was waiting for noon, the exact moment my fabricated insider trading tip claimed the worthless biotech stock would skyrocket to the moon. The grandfather clock in the corner of the suite began to chime. Noon had officially arrived. Brandon eagerly snatched his cell phone off the velvet couch. He opened his cryptocurrency and stock trading application, fully expecting to see his portfolio balance surge to $400,000. Instead, I watched his entire reality fracture. The crystal bourbon glass slipped from his trembling fingers and shattered violently against the hardwood floor, splashing amber liquid all over the tailor's expensive leather shoes. The biotech company had not been acquired by a massive pharmaceutical giant. In fact, right at the opening bell, the company had officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, following a massive federal investigation into their accounting practices. The stock price did not surge 800%. It completely tanked, dropping down to fractions of a single penny. The $50,000 he had recklessly borrowed from the criminal shadow lending syndicate was instantly wiped out. It was gone forever, evaporated into the digital ether of a liquidated margin call. Before Brandon could even process the magnitude of his financial collapse, his phone violently buzzed in his hand. He opened the encrypted messaging application. Even from my hidden vantage point out in the hallway, I could clearly see his face turn the sickly color of wet ash. I did not need to hack his phone to read the screen, because as a financial risk analyst, I know exactly how underground syndicate algorithms operate. They monitor the collateral portfolios they lend against in real time. They knew he had lost their money the exact second the market crashed. The message he received was simple, direct, and utterly terrifying. You owe us $60,000. $50,000 for the principal loan and $10,000 for the immediate inconvenience fee. We want the funds wired to our offshore account by 5 o'clock this evening. If the money is not fully cleared by then, we will come collect our debt in person. We know exactly where your beautiful wedding venue is, groom. Brandon let out a strangled gasp. He jumped off the wooden pedestal, completely ignoring the Italian tailor who was now shouting angrily about the ruined trousers and the shattered glass. Brandon shoved the tailor forcefully out of the suite and slammed the heavy oak door shut, locking the deadbolt behind him. I quietly stepped right up to the door and pressed my ear against the polished wood, listening intently to the beautiful symphony of his panic. I heard him frantically punching numbers into his phone. "Come on. Pick up. Pick up," he muttered desperately. He was calling the escrow office for Apex Holdings, the fake shell company that had supposedly purchased my grandmother's property. He needed an emergency cash advance on the house sale. He genuinely thought he could leverage his stolen real estate money to pay off the violent loan sharks before the ceremony started. The automated voice on the other end of the line was loud enough for me to hear straight through the door. "The number you have reached is no longer in service." Brandon cursed loudly and hung up. He immediately dialed the direct cell phone number of the title agent he had finalized the paperwork with just yesterday. He had no idea that agent was actually an undercover federal investigator. The automated voice repeated the exact same cheerful message. "The number you have dialed has been disconnected." Brandon screamed and threw his phone across the room. I heard the sickening crunch of the device smashing against the brick fireplace. He began to hyperventilate loudly, pacing back and forth across the suite like a trapped, panicked animal in a cage. He had no money in the bank. His credit cards were completely maxed out. Violent loan sharks were threatening to crash his luxury wedding in less than 5 hours. And his only source of stolen funds, the fake real estate buyers, had mysteriously vanished off the face of the earth. I smiled, turning away from the heavy oak door. The walls were rapidly closing in on him, and he was completely out of options. I walked calmly down the hall toward the bridal suite. It was time to put on my beautiful navy bridesmaid dress. I walked calmly down the hall toward the bridal suite. It was time to put on my beautiful navy bridesmaid dress. The suite was a whirlwind of hairspray and nervous energy. Melanie was standing on a velvet stool screaming at a makeup artist about the exact shade of her lip gloss. My mother was frantically steaming a wrinkle out of a silk sash. Nobody even noticed me slip into the corner dressing room. I carefully zipped up my dress and smoothed out the fabric. Just as I was adjusting the neckline, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a secure text message from Andre. The message read, "Brandon just made a desperate move. He used an underground forum to request a mobile notary for an emergency secondary loan. He is trying to borrow against the house again. He scheduled the meeting behind the church in 10 minutes. I intercepted the request. My lead paralegal David is posing as the notary. Get your camera ready." I smiled at my reflection in the mirror. Brandon was truly a textbook case of a desperate gambler. Instead of accepting his total defeat, he was trying to double down by committing yet another felony. He genuinely believed he could forge my signature on a secondary loan, secure the funds to pay off the loan sharks, and somehow hide the entire mess before the ceremony started. I grabbed my car keys and quietly slipped out the back exit of the bridal suite. The area behind the historic cathedral was a narrow cobblestone alleyway lined with heavy iron dumpsters. It was completely hidden from the lavish front entrance where the guests were currently arriving. I quickly walked to my parked car, got inside, and carefully drove it around the block. I parked my vehicle at a slight angle near the alley entrance, perfectly positioning my high-definition dashcam to capture the entire secluded area. I left the engine off but kept the battery running to power the camera. I synced the live video feed directly to my cell phone. Exactly 5 minutes later, the heavy metal service door at the back of the church slowly creaked open. Brandon stepped out into the alley. He looked absolutely terrible. His custom tuxedo shirt was soaked with sweat and his hands were shaking uncontrollably. He kept looking over his shoulder, terrified that Melanie or my mother would catch him. A beat-up silver sedan pulled into the alley and parked right next to the dumpsters. A man stepped out wearing a rumpled suit and carrying a heavy leather binder. It was David, Andre's lead paralegal, playing the role of a shady fast-cash mobile notary to absolute perfection. Brandon rushed over to him, pulling a stack of crumpled papers from his jacket pocket. I watched the entire interaction on my phone screen, zooming in to capture every single detail. Through the cracked window of my car, I could hear their conversation perfectly. "Do you have the stamp?" Brandon asked, his voice cracking with panic. "I need this finalized right now. The lender is waiting for the notarized documents to release the emergency funds." David chewed on a piece of gum and looked at the paperwork with an expression of pure boredom. "This is a secondary lien on a residential property," David said flatly. "The document requires both the primary owner and the TO signer to be present. I only see you here, buddy. Where is this Skylar person?" Brandon swallowed hard, wiping sweat from his forehead. "She is inside getting ready for the wedding. She told me to just handle it. I have her identification right here." He pulled out a photocopy of my driver's license. The same photocopy my mother had illegally provided to him from my stolen security folder. "Just stamp the paper, man. I will give you an extra $500 in cash." David sighed, acting like a corrupt official willing to bend the rules for a bribe. He placed the heavy leather binder flat on the hood of his silver sedan and clicked his pen. "Fine. Sign your name on the first line and sign her name on the second line. But if the bank asks, you were both standing right here when I stamped it." I held my breath as I watched the high-definition video feed. Brandon grabbed the pen. Without a single second of hesitation, he forged my signature directly onto the legal loan document. He did it in broad daylight, right on the hood of a car. David took the paper, stamped it with his official seal, and handed Brandon a digital confirmation code. Brandon let out a massive sigh of relief, thinking he had just secured a new loan to pay off his dangerous debt. He handed David a wad of cash from the pawnshop money, turned around, and rushed back inside the church to prepare for his wedding. He had absolutely no idea that the secondary lender he was submitting the paperwork to was actually another dummy corporation set up by Andre. No money was ever going to be wired to him. He had just created crystal-clear video evidence of himself committing aggravated identity theft and bank fraud. I pressed the save button on my dashcam application and automatically uploaded the encrypted video file to multiple cloud servers. I stepped out of my car and walked back toward the side entrance of the cathedral. The trap was no longer just set. The jaws had completely slammed shut, locking his leg in place. All that was left to do was wait for the hunter to arrive and collect the prize. I smoothed down the fabric of my navy bridesmaid dress, took a deep breath of the crisp morning air, and walked back inside to join the celebration. I did not hide in the shadows. I took a deliberate step forward, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor of the grand hallway. "Are you quite finished writing my fictional criminal record, Mother?" I asked, my voice cutting through the hysterical air like a surgical scalpel. Melanie spun around. Her eyes were bloodshot and the heavy bridal makeup made her look entirely unhinged. She closed the distance between us in 3 frantic strides. Before I could brace myself, she raised both hands and violently shoved my shoulders. I stumbled back a half step, the fabric of my navy dress slipping slightly, but I quickly regained my footing. I did not raise my hands to fight back. I simply smoothed my dress and stared at her. "Unlock my money right now," Melanie screamed, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly in my face. "You miserable, jealous little failure. You are so obsessed with ruining my life because no one will ever want to marry you. I am going to sue you for every single penny you have. I will have you thrown in federal prison for cyber-terrorism." Beatrice stood behind her, nodding vigorously, practically vibrating with nervous energy. "Tell her, Melanie. Tell her we will call the police right now if she does not reverse the hack." I looked at my mother, marveling at her desperate delusion, then returned my gaze to the furious bride. The elite wedding planner was peeking out from the bridal suite, her eyes wide with shock, secretly recording the entire meltdown on her glowing tablet. That was perfect. It was just more concrete evidence for the inevitable civil lawsuits. "You can call the police, Melanie," I said calmly, keeping my voice low and perfectly steady. "In fact, I highly encourage it. But before you dial 911 and report me for a cybercrime that does not exist, you might want to ask your groom a few questions." "Brandon has nothing to do with this," Melanie snapped, though a tiny flicker of doubt finally crossed her eyes. I leaned in, slightly closing the physical distance she had aggressively established. I lowered my voice so only she and my mother could hear the absolute finality in my words. "Your joint account is not frozen, Melanie," I whispered coldly. "It is empty. Brandon drained it last night. He took your $80,000 along with the $150,000 he stole from me, and he put it all into a high-risk cryptocurrency margin account. He tried to day trade volatile meme coins to double his money because he is entirely broke. The market crashed at midnight. He was instantly liquidated by the brokerage platform." Melanie's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The furious red flush in her cheeks rapidly faded into a sickly, translucent white. "That is a disgusting lie," Beatrice hissed, stepping forward to protect her golden boy. "Do not listen to her, Melanie. Brandon is a highly successful financial broker. He would never do something so reckless." I did not even look at my mother. I kept my eyes locked directly on Melanie's terrified face. "If you think I am lying," I continued smoothly, "ask him to open his secure trading application right in front of you. Ask him why he pawned my grandmother's diamond necklace at 2 o'clock this morning. Ask him why he just took a secondary loan against a house he does not legally own from a violent shadow lending syndicate. And most importantly, Melanie, you might want to ask him why there are currently dangerous men from that syndicate scouting his known addresses right now. They are expecting a $60,000 wire transfer by 5 o'clock this evening, and they do not ask politely when they come to collect." Melanie literally staggered backward, her hands dropping limply to her sides. She knew Brandon. She knew his arrogant tendencies and his obsessive need to project a level of wealth he did not actually possess. Deep down, beneath the layers of denial and designer silk, she knew I was telling the absolute truth. "No." Melanie whispered, her voice trembling violently. "No, the floral deposit, the catering check, the venue balance. All bouncing as we speak," I confirmed mercilessly. "My mother wrote a bad check for the caterer this morning. The floral designers are packing up their delivery trucks. If you walk down that aisle today, Melanie, You are legally tying yourself to a man who is actively committing federal wire fraud and dodging organized criminals. You will inherit his massive debt the exact moment you say I do." Melanie turned slowly, looking at my mother. Beatrice was trembling, her face completely drained of color. She could not formulate a single lie to counter my detailed financial breakdown. Her guilty silence was the ultimate confirmation. Melanie did not scream this time. She let out a low, guttural sob, grabbed the heavy skirts of her custom wedding gown, and sprinted down the hallway toward the groom suite. Beatrice chased after her, desperately calling her name, her high heels echoing loudly on the marble floor. I stood alone in the hallway, adjusting my navy blue dress one last time. The bride was finally awake, the mother was entirely exposed, and the groom was about to face the absolute wrath of a woman who just realized she was marrying a sinking stone. The grand finale was rapidly approaching. I walked away from the bridal suite and made my way up a winding marble staircase that led to the cathedral choir loft. From this elevated vantage point, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of both the main sanctuary below and the expansive front parking lot through the massive stained glass windows. Down in the sanctuary, guests were beginning to take their seats in the wooden pews, whispering excitedly to one another. They were completely unaware that the glamorous wedding they were attending was currently burning to the ground in the back rooms. But my attention was quickly drawn to the parking lot. Two black SUVs with heavily tinted windows rolled slowly onto the cobblestone driveway. They did not park in the designated guest area. They idled aggressively right in front of the main stone steps, deliberately blocking the valet lane. Just a moment later, the heavy front doors of the cathedral pushed open. My mother Beatrice stumbled out into the crisp afternoon air. She looked completely disheveled. Melanie had clearly thrown her out of the groom suite during her rampage. Beatrice was pacing frantically, clutching her chest desperately, trying to catch her breath and figure out a way to save her golden boy from the catastrophic financial mess I had just exposed. The doors of the lead SUV opened. 3 men stepped out. They did not look like wedding guests. They wore sharp, dark suits that fit a little too tightly across their broad shoulders. The lead man, a towering figure with a thick neck and a completely flat expression, walked directly up to my mother. I pulled my cell phone from my clutch and opened a specialized audio enhancement application I frequently used for recording corporate meetings in large boardrooms. I pressed my phone against the cool glass of the window, amplifying the conversation happening just outside the heavy wooden doors below me. "Excuse me, ma'am," the lead man said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "We are looking for the groom. Brandon. He is expecting us. We have a rather urgent financial matter to settle before he walks down that aisle." I watched my mother freeze. Her eyes darted to the black SUVs, then back to the imposing men. She knew exactly who they were. Brandon must have confessed his desperate shadow loan to her when she ran into his suite minutes earlier. "He is not here," Beatrice stammered, her voice shaking violently. The audio app picked up her terrified pitch perfectly. "He had to leave. There was an emergency with the catering company." The man stepped closer, invading her personal space. "Do not lie to me, lady. We know he is inside. He owes my employer $60,000. He either wires the money right now or we go inside and collect it in front of all his rich friends. Which is it going to be?" Beatrice backed up against the stone pillar. Pure survival instinct, devoid of any maternal loyalty, completely took over her brain. She looked around frantically, then locked eyes with the terrifying man. "Listen to me," Beatrice whispered urgently. "The money you are looking for, he does not have it here. His sister took it. Skylar. She handles all of his accounts. She stole his money this morning and locked him out. She is the one you want. She has your cash at her apartment right now." The man tilted his head, clearly skeptical. "And where exactly is this sister?" Beatrice did not hesitate for a single second. She opened her designer purse, pulled out a monogrammed pen, and snatched a blank valet ticket from the podium. She hastily scribbled my exact apartment address in Manhattan, along with my private gate security code. She thrust the paper into the man's massive hand. "Go there," Beatrice pleaded, her voice cracking with desperation. "She lives alone. She has a safe in her bedroom closet. Take whatever you want. Just leave my son alone. Let him get married today." The man looked at the address, smirked coldly, and signaled to his associates. They climbed back into the black SUVs. The tires screeched against the cobblestone as they sped out of the parking lot, heading straight for the highway back to the city. I lowered my phone, a cold, hollow laugh escaping my lips. My own mother had just deliberately sent violent organized criminals to my home. She had handed them my address and my security code, actively encouraging them to break into my apartment and attack me, all to buy her degenerate son a few more hours of fake glory. It was the ultimate betrayal, the final nail in the coffin of our familial relationship. But she had gravely underestimated my preparation. 5 minutes later, the smart home security application on my phone flashed a bright red alert: motion detected at front door. Glass break detected. I opened the live video feed. The three men from the SUV were aggressively kicking down my apartment door. They rushed inside, expecting to find a terrified woman hiding in her bedroom. Instead, the video feed captured the beautiful flashing red and blue lights of the New York Police Department. I had anonymously forwarded Brandon's encrypted text messages to the authorities hours ago, alerting them to an armed robbery in progress at my exact address. I watched in pure satisfaction as a dozen heavily armed SWAT officers swarmed the loan sharks, slamming them to my hardwood floor and securing them in handcuffs. By sending those men to my apartment, Beatrice had just officially tied herself to an organized crime investigation as an accomplice. I saved the video footage, turned away from the window, and headed down the stairs toward the main sanctuary. It was time for a wedding. I walked down the winding marble staircase, the heavy bass of the cathedral pipe organ already vibrating through the thick stone walls. The guests were fully seated, and the ushers were closing the heavy oak doors to the main sanctuary. In the dimly lit vestibule, the bridal party was beginning to line up for the grand procession. Suddenly, the side entrance door flew open. My mother Beatrice rushed inside. She was panting heavily, her expensive silk dress slightly wrinkled from her frantic encounter with the loan sharks in the parking lot. She leaned against the wall, clutching her chest, letting out a massive sigh of relief. She genuinely believed she had just saved her golden boy by sending violent criminals to my home. She thought I was miles away, currently being terrorized in my living room. She turned around to join the bridal line and stopped dead in her tracks. All the color instantly vanished from her face. I was standing right in front of her, perfectly composed in my navy blue bridesmaid dress, holding a small bouquet of white roses. Skylar Beatrice gasped, her voice trembling so violently it barely registered over the organ music. "What are you doing here? You are supposed to be at your apartment. You left early." I took a slow, deliberate step toward her. I smiled, tilting my head slightly. "Why on earth would I be at my apartment, Mother? My only brother is getting married today. I would not miss this for the absolute world." Beatrice began to panic, her eyes darting toward the heavy doors, then back to my face. "But the men," she stammered, completely losing her aristocratic composure. "The men from the black vehicles. They went to your address. They are looking for you. You need to leave right now before they come back here." I stepped closer, invading her personal space until I could smell the stale wine on her breath. I lowered my voice to a razor-sharp whisper. "They are not coming back here, Mother. And they are not at my apartment either. Do you really think a licensed financial risk analyst does not monitor her own security systems? The moment you handed those violent criminals my private address and gate code, I forwarded the surveillance footage and Brandon's encrypted text messages straight to the New York Police Department." Beatrice grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging painfully into my skin. "What did you do?" she hissed. I easily brushed her hand away. "I watched them kick my door down on a live video feed," I replied coldly. "And then I watched a heavily armed SWAT team swarm the hallway and arrest all three of them. They are currently sitting in the back of a police cruiser. But here is the best part, Mother. The lead detective called me 5 minutes ago to confirm the arrests. I told him exactly who gave those men my address. You are now officially on a police report as an accessory to an armed home invasion. Beatrice let out a strangled, pathetic whimper. Her legs seemed to give out, and she stumbled backward, catching herself against a marble pillar. You set me up, she cried softly. You set yourself up, I corrected her. You threw your own daughter to a pack of wolves to protect a thief. Now you are going to face the consequences. Before she could respond, the elite wedding planner blew a sharp whistle. The heavy wooden doors leading into the sanctuary swung wide open. The majestic sound of the wedding march echoed through the massive cathedral. It was time. I looked toward the front of the vestibule. Brandon was being practically dragged out of the groom suite by his best man. My brother looked physically ill. His skin was a sickly shade of gray, and he was sweating right through his custom tuxedo jacket. He kept looking over his shoulder, terrified that the loan sharks were about to burst through the doors and break his legs in front of 300 elite guests. He had absolutely no idea they were already in police custody, and he had no idea an even bigger threat was waiting for him. Behind me, Melanie stood rigidly in her custom gown. She had chosen to walk down the aisle not out of love, but out of a desperate need to maintain her social image and avoid a public scandal before she could quietly destroy him with lawyers. Her face was locked into a terrifying plastic smile, but her eyes were filled with pure, unadulterated hatred. I turned away from my devastated mother, adjusted my bouquet, and began my slow, elegant walk down the long aisle. The guests smiled and nodded at me, completely oblivious to the spectacular destruction that was about to unfold. I kept my eyes locked directly on Brandon, who was shaking visibly at the altar. The trap was fully sprung, and the federal hammer was raised high in the air, ready to strike. As I took my designated place at the front of the altar, turning to face the congregation, I felt a subtle vibration against my thigh. It was my secondary phone tucked safely inside a hidden pocket sewn into the seam of my bridesmaid dress. I did not need to look at the screen to know what the notification meant. It was the final official confirmation from Detective Russo of the New York Police Department. The organized crime unit had just finished processing the crime scene at my Manhattan apartment. While my brother stood 3 feet away from me, sweating completely through his custom tuxedo collar, my mind replayed the glorious high-definition security footage I had watched just moments before in the vestibule. I wanted to savor every single detail of the trap I had laid for the violent men my mother had sent to destroy me. When the 3 loan sharks arrived at my apartment building, they bypassed the front desk by tailgating a delivery driver through the service entrance. They marched up to my floor completely confident in their absolute authority. They thought they were dealing with a terrified, helpless woman hoarding her brother's cash in a bedroom safe. The lead thug, the massive man who had cornered my mother in the church parking lot, did not even bother trying to pick the lock. He simply raised his heavy combat boot and kicked my reinforced front door squarely off its hinges. The heavy wood splintered violently, crashing onto my hardwood floor. They rushed into my living room with weapons drawn, shouting demands for the cash. But the apartment was completely empty of civilians. Instead of a cowering financial analyst, they were immediately blinded by the tactical flashlights of 12 heavily armored SWAT officers. I had not just called 911 and reported a break-in. When my mother handed over my address, I immediately contacted Andre. He leveraged his extensive federal contacts to expedite an emergency warrant. The police were already tracking this specific shadow lending syndicate for months, but they lacked the concrete geographical evidence to raid them. By sending those men to my apartment, Beatrice had literally hand-delivered the most dangerous criminals in the city right into a fortified police ambush. The security cameras captured the sheer terror on the thugs' faces as the officers slammed them against my expensive quartz countertops. They were disarmed, handcuffed, and read their Miranda rights in less than 45 seconds. But the most beautiful part of the entire operation was the evidence collection. When Detective Russo searched the lead thug, he pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his jacket pocket. It was the valet ticket from the cathedral. It had my exact apartment address, my private gate code, and my floor number scribbled on the back. The handwriting was unmistakably my mother's elegant cursive script. The detective had texted me a photograph of the valet ticket sitting in a clear plastic evidence bag before the ceremony started. That tiny piece of paper was the ultimate legal checkmate. By writing down my security code and directing armed extortionists to my home to protect her son's fraudulent debts, Beatrice crossed a massive legal line. She was no longer just a terrible mother who enabled her golden child. She was now officially documented on a police record as an active accomplice to armed extortion conspiracy to commit a home invasion and reckless endangerment. Her desperate attempt to sacrifice her daughter to save her son had completely backfired. She had woven her own neck into the exact same criminal noose that was currently tightening around Brandon. She would face mandatory minimum sentencing right alongside the violent men she hired. I stood quietly at the altar, holding my bouquet of white roses, and let out a soft, completely relaxed sigh. The ambient noise of the cathedral faded into the background. I watched Melanie slowly marching down the long aisle toward us, her face completely pale beneath her expensive veil. Her eyes were fixed on Brandon, burning with a mixture of terror and absolute rage. She knew he was broke. She knew the vendor checks were bouncing, but she still did not know about the federal real estate fraud or the fact that the police were involved. Brandon reached out his trembling hand to take hers as she stepped up to the altar. He forced a pathetic, watery smile, trying to play the role of the confident groom. He had survived the 12 o'clock margin call. He thought the loan sharks were currently robbing my apartment, buying him enough time to get through the ceremony and secure his wealthy bride. He thought he had outsmarted everyone. He had absolutely no idea that his criminal associates were already in jail, and his reign of terror was about to end in a spectacular fashion. The heavy pipe organ hit a deep, resounding bass note that vibrated through the thick floorboards of the historic cathedral. The congregation rose to their feet in unison, the rustle of expensive silk and tailored suits filling the massive cavernous space. Up at the altar, Brandon adjusted his cuffs for the 5th time in a single minute. From my position at the back of the cathedral, waiting for my cue to walk, I could see the visible sheen of nervous sweat coating his forehead. He kept his eyes locked on the heavy oak doors, completely misinterpreting the situation. In his desperate, fractured mind, he believed the lack of an immediate disruption meant his hired thugs were successfully ransacking my apartment right at that very moment. He thought he had bought his future with my blood. He squared his shoulders, puffing out his chest, trying to project the image of a wealthy, victorious patriarch. He actually thought he had dodged the bullet. The wedding coordinator, an overly anxious woman with a clipboard, gestured for the procession to begin. The groomsmen walked first, matching Brandon in their rented finery, stepping in time to the slow, traditional music. Then came the bridesmaids. Melanie had deliberately chosen a muddy, unflattering shade of navy blue for our dresses, pairing the color with a shapeless, overly conservative cut that hung awkwardly on every single woman. She wanted her bridal party to look as dull and unappealing as possible, so she could be the sole center of attention in her designer white gown. What neither she nor my mother knew was that I had taken my dress to a master tailor 3 weeks ago. I did not just have the dress hemmed to fit my height. I paid a premium to have the entire garment surgically reconstructed. The dull, heavy fabric had been overlaid with a subtle, shimmering silk chiffon that caught the cathedral lighting perfectly with every movement. The shapeless waist had been completely cinched, highlighting my silhouette, and the conservative neckline had been expertly dropped into a tasteful, elegant sweetheart cut. It was no longer a frumpy background costume meant to make me look like a pathetic spinster sister. It was a breathtaking custom couture gown that looked like it belonged on a high-fashion runway in Paris. The coordinator pointed her pen at me. It was my turn. I stepped out from the shadows of the vestibule and into the warm golden light of the main aisle. The reaction from the guests was immediate and impossible to ignore. A collective murmur rippled through the wooden pews, heads turned and eyes widened. Whispers erupted among the wealthy socialites my brother was trying so desperately to impress. I did not walk with the typical nervous shuffle of a subordinate bridesmaid. I walked with the slow, measured grace of a woman who owned the entire building. My head was held high, my posture absolute perfection. I was radiating a quiet, dangerous power, completely outshining the bride before the bride had even set foot in the room. I kept my gaze fixed directly on the altar. As I reached the halfway point of the long, velvet-carpeted aisle, Brandon finally looked at me. I watched the arrogant, manufactured confidence drain right out of his face in real time. He blinked rapidly, completely thrown off balance by my appearance. I was supposed to be a dowdy, embarrassed afterthought. Instead, I looked like an absolute queen. But it was not just the custom dress that terrified him, it was the simple, undeniable fact that I was standing right there in front of him, entirely unharmed and perfectly composed. His eyes widened as the mathematical impossibility hit his panicked brain. If the violent shadowlenders had broken into my apartment exactly as my mother had planned, I should have been miles away dealing with the police or recovering from an assault. I should not be gliding down the aisle to the sound of angelic choir music. I reached the front of the church and took my place opposite the groomsmen. I turned slightly, putting myself in Brandon's direct line of sight. I looked him dead in the eyes. I did not break contact for a single second. I let a slow, chilling, utterly victorious smile spread across my face. It was the smile of a predator watching a trapped animal finally realize the cage door was locked and the key was already thrown away. Brandon swallowed hard. His chest began to heave with shallow, panicked breaths. He looked at my mother, who was sitting in the front pew weeping silently into a lace handkerchief. He thought they were tears of joy for his big day. He had no idea they were tears of profound legal terror. The bullet he thought he had successfully dodged had actually ricocheted right back toward his head. The organ music shifted to a grand, triumphant crescendo. The heavy doors at the back of the cathedral swung open one final time. Melanie stood in the threshold, framed by the bright afternoon sunlight. She looked beautiful in her extravagant dress, but her face was a rigid mask of fury, her eyes completely devoid of love. She began her long, angry march toward the altar, totally unaware that she was walking straight into a federal trap. The calm before the storm had officially passed. The sky was turning pitch black and the lightning was about to strike. Melanie took her very first step down the pristine white runner, her heavy silk train dragging gracefully across the marble floor. The congregation collectively held their breath, turning their heads to admire the bride. The moment was supposed to be picture perfect, the ultimate culmination of Brandon's meticulously crafted lie. But before Melanie could take a second step, a tall, imposing figure stepped out from the second row of the wooden pews, stepping directly into the center of the main aisle and completely blocking her path. It was Andre. He did not look like a grateful guest who had been shoved into the background by a racist family. He looked like an absolute executioner in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. He completely ignored the synchronized gasps of the 300 elite socialites sitting in the cathedral. Andre did not look at Melanie. He turned his back to the bride and began walking slowly and deliberately down the aisle toward the altar. The cathedral organist, an elderly man perched high in the choir loft, noticed the disruption. His fingers hesitated on the keys, and the grand, triumphant wedding march stumbled into an awkward, echoing halt. The sudden silence in the massive stone building was absolutely deafening. You could hear the faint rustle of silk and the nervous shifting of leather shoes. Brandon stepped forward from his position next to the priest, his face flushed with an ugly, panicked red. His fake bravado surged forward, fueled by sheer embarrassment and his deeply ingrained habit of treating Andre like a subordinate. "What the hell are you doing?" Brandon hissed, his voice echoing loudly across the silent altar. "Get out of the aisle and get back to your seat. You are ruining the ceremony. Security, someone get him out of here." Andre did not stop walking. He did not break eye contact. He climbed the 3 marble steps leading up to the altar, completely ignoring the confused priest and the terrified groomsmen who instinctively took a step back. Andre stopped exactly 2 feet away from my brother. He reached his hand into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope secured with a red legal seal. Andre pressed the envelope directly against Brandon's chest with a solid, authoritative thump. "You have been served, man," Andre said, his voice deep, calm, and projecting effortlessly throughout the silent church. Brandon instinctively grabbed the envelope before it could fall. He looked down at the thick package, his eyes wide with frantic confusion. He let out a nervous, high-pitched scoff. "What is this? Is this some kind of terrible joke? You are interrupting my wedding to hand me junk mail." I stood just a few feet away, holding my white roses, watching the color completely drain from my mother's face in the front row. Beatrice knew exactly what was happening. She gripped the wooden pew so hard her knuckles turned entirely white. "Open it, Brandon," Andre commanded softly. Brandon's hands were shaking so violently he could barely tear the red seal. He ripped the top of the envelope open and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. I watched his eyes scan the front page. He saw the official embossed seal of the federal court. He saw his own forged signature printed in high-definition ink. He saw the name of the plaintiff listed in bold black letters. The Federal Historic Preservation Trust. "That is a formal notification of a federal lawsuit and a preliminary injunction," Andre explained, making sure his voice carried to the front rows where the wealthiest guests were sitting. "It details multiple counts of grand larceny, identity theft, and wire fraud regarding the unauthorized sale of the property located in upstate New York. You forged your sister's signature and illegally sold a property that was owned by the federal government." Brandon physically swayed on his feet, looking like a man who had just been struck by a speeding train. The documents in his hands shook uncontrollably. He looked up at Andre, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "How did you get this?" Brandon whispered, his voice cracking with sheer terror. "You are just a paper pusher. You are just a clerk at a legal aid clinic." Andre smiled. It was a brilliant, freezing cold smile that commanded absolute, undeniable respect. He adjusted his suit jacket, standing tall and victorious. "Turns out I am not just a clerk," Brandon Andre replied smoothly. "I am the senior partner at the law firm representing the federal trust you tried to defraud yesterday. And those buyers you thought were naive private investors, they were undercover federal agents. You walked right into a federal sting operation." The heavy legal document slipped from Brandon's trembling fingers. The thick stack of papers hit the marble floor, scattering in every direction, completely littering the holy altar with the undeniable proof of his crimes. Down in the main aisle, Melanie let out a piercing, horrified scream, finally realizing that the man waiting for her was not a wealthy broker, but a desperate, penniless criminal. The trap was sprung, and there was absolutely nowhere left for him to run. Brandon stared blankly at the scattered papers covering the polished marble floor. The murmurs from the congregation instantly escalated into a chaotic roar of hushed whispers. Wealthy socialites leaned out of their wooden pews, craning their necks to get a better look at the groom. The priest standing at the center of the altar took a slow step backward, clutching his leather-bound Bible tightly against his chest, completely unsure of how to proceed. Brandon bent down, his hands trembling so violently that he could not even pinch the corners of the documents. He managed to scoop up a few pages, crumpling the crisp paper in his sweaty palms. He looked up at Andre, who remained standing on the altar like a towering statue of justice. "I need a minute." Brandon choked out, his voice barely a raspy whisper. He turned to his best man, a wealthy college fraternity brother who currently looked like he wanted to be completely invisible. "I just need to use the restroom," Brandon stammered. "I will be right back." He did not wait for a response. Brandon spun around and practically stumbled off the raised marble platform. He did not walk back down the main center aisle where Melanie was currently standing, frozen in absolute horror. Instead, he veered sharply to the right, heading toward the heavy oak side doors that led out to the private garden courtyard. He was moving with the frantic, jerky motions of a cornered animal. I remained standing perfectly still in my bridesmaid line, watching him flee. Beatrice half stood from her front row pew, reaching a trembling hand out toward him, but she was too paralyzed by shock to actually chase after her golden child. Brandon hit the heavy wooden side doors with his shoulder, pushing them open with all his remaining strength. The doors swung outward, revealing the bright afternoon sunlight and the manicured stone pathways of the church courtyard. For a split second, Brandon actually thought he had found an escape route. He thought he could sprint across the garden, jump the wrought iron fence, and vanish into the city streets. But his desperate fantasy shattered the exact moment his leather shoes touched the exterior stone steps. Parked aggressively across the narrow alleyway exit, completely blocking the only path out of the courtyard, were two massive black sport utility vehicles. These vehicles had official federal government license plates. Standing casually in front of the black grills were four men wearing tactical vests with the letters FBI printed in bold yellow across their chests. They did not draw their weapons or shout commands. The lead federal agent simply crossed his arms over his chest, looked directly at my brother, and offered a cold, knowing smirk. They were entirely content to let him finish his public humiliation before they formally placed the handcuffs on his wrists. They knew he had absolutely nowhere to go. Brandon stopped dead on the top step. The crisp, outdoor air hit his face, but he could not breathe. A massive panic attack seized his chest. He grabbed the stone railing, gasping for oxygen like a man drowning in the middle of the ocean. His vision blurred, and the edges of the courtyard began to tunnel in tight around him. He leaned over the railing, dry, heaving violently into the manicured rose bushes. His legs felt like lead. He was completely, utterly trapped. There was no secret exit. There was no miraculous legal loophole. There was no more stolen money to bail him out. He slowly pushed himself off the stone railing, wiping his mouth with the back of his trembling hand. He turned around, staring at the open church doors. Going back inside meant facing his furious bride, his shattered reputation, and the absolute end of his life as he knew it. But staying outside meant surrendering immediately to the federal agents waiting at the bottom of the steps. He chose the only option that delayed his arrest by a few more agonizing minutes. He pulled the heavy wooden doors open and stepped back into the dimly lit sanctuary. The walk back to the altar was a death march. Every single eye in the massive cathedral was locked directly onto his sweaty, pale face. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a suffocating, judgmental silence. But the worst part was not the staring guests. The worst part was the woman currently marching furiously down the center aisle to meet him. Melanie had recovered from her initial shock. The terrified bride had completely vanished, replaced by a woman consumed by pure, unadulterated vengeance. She abandoned her slow, elegant wedding march. She grabbed the heavy silk skirts of her custom gown, hoisting them up to her knees, and stomped down the velvet carpet. Her face was twisted into a terrifying mask of rage. She did not care about the guests or the photographer anymore. She reached the front of the altar exactly as Brandon dragged his feet back onto the marble platform, completely trapping him between his furious fiancée and the undeniable evidence of his federal crimes. Melanie stood face to face with Brandon. Her veil was pushed back, revealing a face completely devoid of bridal joy. She looked down at the federal documents scattered across the marble, then up at his sweaty, terrified face. "We are finishing this ceremony," Melanie whispered, her voice a venomous hiss that only those of us on the altar could hear. "You are going to smile, you are going to say your vows, and then my father's lawyers are going to dissect your entire life. Do not say a single word." Brandon swallowed hard, nodding frantically. He was too terrified to argue. He just wanted the ceremony to shield him for a few more minutes. He genuinely thought that if he could just get the ring on her finger, he might still have access to her family's massive legal resources to fight the federal charges. It was a delusion of epic proportions. The priest, an older man who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on the planet, nervously cleared his throat. He stepped carefully over the scattered pages of the federal indictment, adjusting his collar. He opened his leather-bound book. His hands were shaking so badly the pages rustled against his lapel microphone. He decided the best course of action was to simply rush through the traditional liturgy as fast as humanly possible before the police came inside. He skipped the grand sermon. He skipped the romantic readings. He went straight for the binding declarations. The cathedral was dead silent, save for the echoing voice of the terrified priest and the sound of Brandon's ragged breathing. Dearly beloved, the priest began, his voice wavering through the massive speakers. We are gathered here today to witness the union of Brandon and Melanie. I stood in my perfectly tailored navy dress, holding my white roses, watching the pathetic charade unfold. Andre had already stepped back into his pew, sitting down next to his wife with a look of profound, quiet satisfaction. The federal agents were waiting outside the garden doors. The loan sharks were sitting in a police precinct downtown. But there was still one final piece of business I needed to attend to. Brandon's public image, the fake empire he had built on a foundation of lies, and my stolen money needed to be dismantled just as thoroughly as his finances. The priest turned the page of his book. He reached the traditional age-old question. It is a line that most modern ceremonies completely remove, but my mother had insisted on a strictly traditional high church wedding script to impress the wealthy conservative guests. If anyone can show just cause why this couple cannot lawfully be joined together in holy matrimony, the priest announced, his voice echoing off the vaulted stone ceilings, speak now or forever hold your peace. He paused for a fraction of a second, fully expecting absolute silence so he could rush to the ring exchange. I did not wait. I took a deliberate step forward, breaking the perfect symmetry of the bridesmaid line. My leather heels struck the marble floor with a sharp, echoing crack that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. I object, I said. My voice was not a shout. It was calm, measured, and projected perfectly across the silent church. A collective theatrical gasp ripped through the congregation of 300 elite guests. People literally clutched their pearls. Whispers erupted like a sudden wildfire, jumping from pew to pew. Melanie whipped her head around to glare at me, her eyes burning with fresh outrage. Brandon looked like his heart had just stopped completely. From the front row, my mother leaped to her feet. "Skylar, sit down right now." Beatrice hissed, her voice a frantic, desperate command. She lunged forward, trying to grab the fabric of my dress. "You are ruining everything. Have you not done enough to your brother today?" I easily stepped out of her reach, looking down at her with absolute disgust. "I am just getting started, Beatrice," I replied coldly, dropping the title of mother entirely. I tossed my bouquet of white roses directly onto the marble floor, letting them land right on top of the scattered federal indictment papers. I turned my back on the altar and began walking down the center aisle. I did not rush. I walked with the same slow, deliberate grace I had used during the procession. The guests watched me in stunned silence, parting slightly as I passed their pews. I made direct eye contact with my Aunt Patricia, the same woman who had texted me yesterday to praise my generous financial gift. She looked away, deeply uncomfortable. I walked all the way to the back of the massive cathedral, heading straight for the elevated audio and visual control booth tucked beneath the choir loft. The young sound engineer manning the booth looked absolutely terrified as I approached. He was wearing a cheap headset and holding a sound mixing board slider, completely frozen in shock. "Step aside," I instructed him firmly. "I need access to the main projection system right now." He did not argue. He took one look at my face, ripped his headset off, and scrambled out of the booth, practically running out the back doors. I stepped up to the massive soundboard. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my digital tablet. I grabbed the master auxiliary video cable connected to the cathedral's massive drop-down projection screens and plugged it directly into my device. Brandon was shouting something from the altar, demanding that someone stop me, but his voice sounded tiny and pathetic from this distance. I tapped the screen of my tablet, bypassing the security lock, and opened the master evidence folder I had compiled the night before. I was about to give the guests exactly what they came for: a truly unforgettable show. I pressed the play button on the master media application, High above the altar, two massive motorized projection screens typically reserved for displaying hymn lyrics slowly descended from the vaulted ceiling. The cathedral lights automatically dimmed, plunging the congregation into a dramatic cinematic darkness. The high-definition projectors flickered to life, casting a brilliant, blinding light directly onto the screens positioned just behind the altar where Brandon and Melanie stood. The pristine audio system of the cathedral, designed to amplify delicate choir solos, suddenly blasted the crisp ambient noise of the alleyway behind the church. The video filled the massive screens. It was the dashcam footage from earlier that very morning. The image was crystal clear. 300 elite guests watched in absolute silence as the towering projection showed Brandon standing next to the iron dumpsters, sweating profusely, negotiating with the undercover paralegal. The audio was undeniable. Every single person in the room heard Brandon beg the fake notary to stamp the document. They watched him pull out my stolen identification. And then, in glorious high definition, they watched the groom lean over the hood of the silver sedan and deliberately forge my signature onto a secondary loan document using my grandmother's house as collateral. He handed over a bribe of $500, sealing his guilt on camera for everyone to witness. A wave of collective revulsion washed over the wooden pews. People gasped out loud. Several elderly guests covered their mouths in shock. Down at the altar, Brandon was completely paralyzed. He stared up at his own giant sweating face on the projection screen, his mouth hanging wide open. He looked like a man watching his own public execution. He took a weak step backward, bumping into the floral arrangement, completely unable to form a single word of defense. But I was not finished. The video faded to black, and the screen transitioned to a simple audio equalizer graphic. The audio clip from the rehearsal dinner hallway began to play. The acoustics of the cathedral amplified his cruel, arrogant tone perfectly. The guests heard my simulated crying, begging for my rent money. Then they heard Brandon's unmistakable sneer. I did not steal it. I reallocated it to a better cause. His recorded voice boomed through the massive speakers. That was family money. I needed it to secure a wedding venue that does not smell like cheap bleach. I did what I had to do to protect the family image, take an Uber home Skylar. The guests who had praised my supposed generosity just yesterday now realized the horrifying truth. The lavish food they were about to eat, the expensive champagne they were going to drink, the very flowers surrounding the altar, it was all funded by a massive, heartless theft against the groom's own sister. I watched my Aunt Patricia bury her face in her hands, shaking her head in disgust. Beatrice sank lower into her front row pew, trying to physically hide from the crushing weight of the public humiliation she had helped orchestrate. Then came the final clip. It was the continuation of the hallway recording a part I had saved specifically for the bride. On the audio track, right after he threw the crumpled $100 bill at me, Brandon kept talking. He had thought he was completely alone with me, entirely uninhibited by consequence or morality. You think I actually want to deal with Melanie and her snobby parents for the rest of my life? The recorded voice of Brandon scoffed loudly. Please. She is a materialistic gold digger who spends money faster than I can print it. I am just using her family's social connections to secure my senior partner promotion. Once I get my hands on her trust fund and cement my status, I will dump her in 2 years. She is just an expensive stepping stone, Skylar. Now get out of my sight. The audio file ended. The massive screens faded to a solid, stark white, illuminating the horrified faces of the congregation. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating, terrifying silence that pressed down on the entire cathedral. Nobody whispered. Nobody moved. 300 of the wealthiest, most influential people in the city stared at the altar, completely disgusted by the monster standing in front of them. The fake empire Brandon had spent his entire life building was completely obliterated in less than 3 minutes of undeniable proof. Melanie stood perfectly still. The custom veil framed a face that had turned the color of solid granite. Her hands were clenched into tight fists at her sides, crushing the delicate silk of her expensive gown. The man she was about to marry had just admitted in front of her entire family and social circle that he despised her, intended to steal her trust fund, and planned to divorce her the moment she served her purpose. He had humiliated her on a monumental, unforgettable scale, and the reckoning was finally here. Melanie shattered the silence. A primal, echoing scream ripped from her throat as she stepped forward and swung her hand with every ounce of fury in her body. The slap echoed like a second gunshot across the massive cathedral. Her diamond engagement ring caught Brandon squarely on his upper lip, splitting the fragile skin instantly. A bright drop of blood welled up and trickled down his chin. He stumbled backward, clutching his mouth, his eyes flashing with sudden, violent anger. He dropped his hands and lunged forward, raising his fist to retaliate violently against the furious bride who had just publicly humiliated him. But before he could even extend his arm, the massive wooden doors at the back of the cathedral violently burst open. The heavy oak slammed against the stone walls with a deafening crash. Sunlight poured into the darkened vestibule, silhouetting 6 federal agents wearing tactical gear and windbreakers with FBI printed in bold yellow letters. The lead agent, the same man who had been waiting patiently outside the courtyard, marched straight down the center aisle. He did not slow his pace, and he did not care about the hundreds of terrified socialites scrambling frantically out of his way. Federal agents, the lead man shouted his voice, commanding absolute authority over the chaotic room. "Stay in your seats. Nobody moves." He bypassed the terrified bridesmaids and the groomsmen who were actively trying to press themselves into the stone walls. He climbed the marble steps to the altar without a shred of hesitation. Brandon froze, his raised fist dropping limply to his side. He looked at the imposing agents, then at the scattered documents, and finally at his bleeding lip. The fight instantly drained out of him, replaced by the hollow, vacant stare of a completely defeated man. "Turn around right now and place your hands behind your back," the lead agent ordered, pulling a heavy pair of steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. Brandon did not argue. He slowly turned around, submitting to the inevitable reality. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking into place echoed perfectly through the quiet church. It was the only sound that mattered. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny," the agent recited calmly, spinning Brandon back around to face the congregation. "You have the right to remain silent, which I highly suggest you do considering your recent audio performances here today." As the agents began dragging the weeping groom down the aisle, my mother completely snapped. The sight of her golden child being hauled away in steel chains shattered the final remaining pieces of her sanity. She let out a horrific, animalistic shriek and charged straight toward the audio booth at the back of the church where I was standing. Her face was contorted in pure rage, her hands curled into claws, fully intending to physically assault me right in front of federal law enforcement officers and 300 elite witnesses. She never even made it within 10 feet of me. Andre moved with the blinding speed and precision of a man who had anticipated this exact reaction. He stepped out from his pew and completely blocked her path, planting his feet firmly on the marble floor. Beatrice slammed into his broad shoulders and rebounded, nearly falling backward onto the velvet carpet. She raised her fists, screaming at him to move, but Andre simply crossed his arms and looked down at her with absolute, unwavering authority. "I would think very carefully about your next move," Beatrice Andre stated, his voice as cold and sharp as a surgical scalpel. "According to New York State Penal Code Section 120.00, attempting to strike my client constitutes assault in the 3rd degree. Furthermore, since you are currently under active investigation for your role in an armed extortion plot, adding a violent public assault to your criminal record will ensure the judge denies your bail tomorrow morning. Do you really want to share a federal transport van with the loan sharks you hired, or are you going to sit down and be quiet?" Beatrice froze, her raised fists trembling violently in the air. The harsh legal reality of her situation finally pierced through her blinding rage. She looked at Andre, then at the federal agents hauling her son out the front doors, and finally at me. She collapsed onto the wooden bench of the nearest pew, burying her face in her hands and sobbing hysterically. The cathedral was left in complete ruins. The wedding was over, the groom was in federal custody, and the mother was utterly broken. I disconnected my tablet from the cathedral soundboard, tucked it neatly into my clutch, and walked gracefully out the heavy oak back doors into the bright sunlight. I stepped out the heavy oak back doors into the bright sunlight. The crisp afternoon air felt incredibly clean, a sharp contrast to the suffocating toxic atmosphere I had just left behind in the cathedral. In the distance, the wail of police sirens echoed through the city streets, a fitting soundtrack to the spectacular collapse of my brother's fake empire. The pristine church parking lot was in absolute chaos. The valets were sprinting back and forth, frantically retrieving luxury vehicles for the horrified guests who were fleeing the scene as fast as humanly possible. Nobody wanted to be associated with a federal criminal. As they rushed past me, aunts, uncles, and wealthy socialites averted their eyes. They whispered frantically to one another, completely ignoring the woman they had all dismissed as the bitter, jealous sister just 24 hours ago. I walked slowly toward my modest sedan, pulling my car keys from my clutch. I had taken exactly 10 steps when the heavy wooden doors behind me banged open once more. "Skylar, wait." The voice was a desperate, ragged shriek. I stopped and turned around. My mother Beatrice was stumbling down the stone steps. Her perfectly styled hair was a wild, frizzy mess. Her expensive silk dress was wrinkled and stained with tears. She had completely abandoned her lifelong obsession with aristocratic grace and public dignity. She practically ran across the cobblestone driveway, her high heels scraping awkwardly against the pavement. When she reached me, her legs gave out completely. Right there in the middle of the parking lot, in full view of the remaining fleeing guests, Beatrice fell to her knees. She grabbed the hem of my custom navy gown, sobbing uncontrollably. "Skylar, please," she begged, her voice cracking with pure desperation. "You have to help him. You have to fix this. You are a financial risk analyst. You know the banking system. You have to pay his bail. He cannot go to federal prison. He will not survive in there. They will destroy him." I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel invisible, the woman who had actively handed my social security number to a thief, the woman who had given violent loan sharks my home address just a few hours ago. I gently but firmly pulled the fabric of my dress out of her frantic grip. I took a step back, looking at her with an expression of absolute freezing indifference. "I cannot pay his bail, Beatrice," I said calmly. "Yes, you can," she sobbed, reaching for my hands. "I know he took your savings, but you have excellent credit. You can take out a personal loan. You can liquidate your retirement accounts. You can hire Andre to represent him. You are family, Skylar. You have to save your brother." I shook my head slowly, marveling at the sheer depth of her delusion. Even now, kneeling in the wreckage of her own making, she expected me to set myself on fire to keep her golden child warm. "I am not going to liquidate my retirement to save a criminal," I replied, my voice dropping to a sharp, clinical tone. "But even if I possessed the desire to help him, which I absolutely do not, I could not do it. And frankly, Beatrice, you should be far more worried about your own financial survival right now." Beatrice stopped crying. She looked up at me, her tear-streaked face twisting in confusion. "What do you mean?" I looked down at her coldly. "You see, the Internal Revenue Service is auditing your personal accounts as we speak." Beatrice gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "That bad check you wrote for the catering company this morning," I continued mercilessly. "You knew you did not have $15,000 in liquid cash. You wrote it anyway to buy Brandon a few more hours. But catering companies use automated corporate banking systems. The moment their accounting department ran that check through their mobile deposit application, it bounced immediately. And because your banking profile was already digitally linked to Brandon's flagged accounts, your massive overdraft triggered an automatic federal fraud alert." Beatrice shook her head frantically. No, it was just a temporary hold. I can call the bank manager. I know him." "You cannot call anyone, Beatrice. The bank manager cannot override a federal freeze. Your accounts are completely locked pending a full criminal investigation. Your credit lines are severed. You have absolutely zero access to capital. You are completely, utterly broke. I leaned in slightly, delivering the final crushing blow. And considering the New York Police Department currently has your handwritten valet ticket in an evidence bag for conspiracy to commit armed extortion, I highly suggest you start figuring out how you are going to pay for your own bail money, because Brandon is not the only one going to jail this week. Beatrice let out a hollow, devastated wheeze. Her eyes widened as the complete totality of her ruin finally crashed down upon her. She was losing the colonial house. She was losing her wealthy social circle. She was losing her freedom. She slumped forward, pressing her forehead against the cold cobblestone of the parking lot, completely defeated by her own toxic greed. I turned my back on my mother, walked to my car, and unlocked the door. I did not look back. I started the engine of my car and drove out of the cathedral parking lot, leaving the wreckage of my family entirely in the rearview mirror. The weekend passed in a quiet, incredibly peaceful blur. I drank my morning coffee, read the financial news, and enjoyed the absolute silence of my apartment. By the time Monday morning arrived, the swift and brutal machinery of the federal justice system was already operating at maximum capacity. I put on a sharp-tailored suit and met Andre at the federal courthouse downtown. We took our seats in the back row of the wooden viewing gallery, waiting for the first round of arraignments to begin. When the heavy side doors of the courtroom opened, Brandon was escorted inside by two armed marshals. The stark contrast was absolutely breathtaking. Just 48 hours ago, he was standing at an altar in a custom-tailored Italian tuxedo, completely convinced he was the untouchable king of New York. Now he was shuffling into a sterile courtroom, wearing an oversized faded beige prison jumpsuit. His wrists and ankles were bound by heavy steel chains that clinked loudly with every single step. He looked pale, exhausted, and entirely broken. The federal prosecutor did not waste any time. He stood before the judge and laid out the undeniable mountain of evidence we had meticulously provided. He detailed the forged property deed, the interstate wire fraud, the massive gambling losses on unregulated cryptocurrency markets, and the extremely dangerous debt owed to the violent shadow lending syndicate. But the final nail in the coffin was the dashcam footage of Brandon forging a secondary loan document in the church alleyway just hours before his arrest. The prosecutor argued that Brandon was an extreme flight risk. He possessed the digital knowledge to move hidden funds offshore. He had active ties to organized criminals who could facilitate his disappearance. And he had literally attempted to flee through the church courtyard when the federal agents arrived. The judge, an incredibly stern woman with zero tolerance for white-collar crime, agreed completely. She slammed her wooden gavel down, formally denying bail. Brandon was remanded to federal custody pending his trial. He spun around frantically, searching the gallery for our mother, hoping she would somehow stand up and save him. But Beatrice was nowhere to be found. She was currently sitting in a police interrogation room across town, desperately trying to explain her handwritten valet ticket to the extortion detectives. Brandon was completely, utterly alone. While Brandon was being hauled back to his concrete holding cell, Melanie was launching her own desperate legal offensive. By Tuesday morning, her father's aggressive team of corporate lawyers had filed an emergency petition for a total annulment, citing gross financial misrepresentation and criminal fraud. Melanie wanted to completely erase the disastrous weekend from her pristine social record. She wanted to pretend she had never even met my brother. But there was a massive, incredibly expensive catch waiting for her. In her obsessive rush to secure the most luxurious vendors in the city, Melanie had proudly co-signed every single master contract. The historic cathedral venue, the elite catering company, the custom floral designers, and the bespoke photography team all required joint financial liability. When Brandon's crypto accounts were liquidated and my mother's fraudulent catering check bounced spectacularly, those elite vendors did not simply walk away. They immediately triggered the default clauses in their contracts and went straight after the second signature on the dotted line. Melanie was now legally bound to $80,000 in outstanding wedding debt. She ran crying to her billionaire parents, expecting them to simply write a check and make the problem disappear. But her parents were absolutely furious. Their elite social reputation had been dragged through the mud by a federal raid at their daughter's wedding. They completely cut her off financially, refusing to pay a single cent for a scandalous, fraudulent event. Melanie was forced to quietly pawn her designer handbags, her luxury shoes, and her massive diamond engagement ring just to keep the aggressive collection agencies from seizing her trust fund assets. As for Brandon's professional life, the destruction was absolute. By Wednesday afternoon, the prestigious brokerage firm where he worked issued a very public press release. They officially terminated his employment, citing a strict zero-tolerance policy for financial fraud and criminal activity. Immediately following the termination, the state and federal financial regulatory authorities stepped in. Brandon's brokerage licenses were permanently revoked. He could never legally trade, broker, or manage a single dollar for the rest of his natural life. Andre sat across from me in my office later that week, reviewing the final public docket. The federal prosecutor was not offering a lenient plea deal. Because Brandon had deliberately defrauded a federal preservation trust and transmitted forged documents across state lines, they were pushing for the absolute maximum penalty. Brandon was staring down the barrel of up to 10 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. There is no early parole in the federal prison system. He would spend the entirety of his youth locked inside a concrete cage, stripped of the wealth and status he had sacrificed his own sister to achieve. The golden child had officially turned to rust. Exactly 1 year has passed since the golden child officially turned to rust. Today, the only metal I interact with is the brushed steel frame of the floor-to-ceiling windows in my brand-new corner office. I stood looking out over the sprawling Manhattan skyline, watching the morning sunlight reflect off the glass skyscrapers. The polished mahogany door behind me bore a frosted glass logo. It was the emblem of the highly successful financial and legal consulting firm I had co-founded with Andre 6 months ago. We combined his ruthless legal expertise with my forensic risk analysis to build an agency specifically designed to hunt down corporate fraud. Business was unsurprisingly absolutely booming. We built our reputation on dismantling the exact kind of financial arrogance my brother possessed. Corporations hire us to find the hidden risks, the secret embezzlements, and the quiet frauds that destroy companies from the inside out. Andre brings the legal fire, and I bring the mathematical precision. Together, we are an absolute nightmare for anyone trying to cheat the system. I walked over to my desk, poured a fresh cup of coffee, and let the profound silence of my new life wash over me. The chaos of my toxic family was completely gone, replaced by a deep, unshakable peace. The justice system had worked with terrifying efficiency. Brandon pleaded guilty to avoid a drawn-out trial, hoping for leniency. The judge gave him 8 years in a federal penitentiary in Pennsylvania. He spends his days working in the prison laundry room, earning mere cents an hour, a far cry from the wealthy broker lifestyle he desperately tried to fake. I heard through the legal grapevine that he has not received a single visitor since his transfer. My mother, Beatrice, avoided prison time by pleading down to a lesser charge of reckless endangerment, but the financial devastation was absolute. The IRS completely dismantled her life. She was forced to sell the sprawling colonial house at a massive loss just to cover her legal fees and the massive tax penalties. She now lives in a tiny one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. The wealthy socialites she spent her entire life trying to impress immediately blacklisted her. She is a complete ghost in the world she used to rule. And Melanie, the furious bride, is still paying off the mountain of debt from the ruined wedding. Without her parents' financial backing, she was forced to get a regular job as an administrative assistant answering phones for a local real estate agency. The heavy oak door to my office swung open, and Andre walked in. He looked sharper than ever in a custom-tailored navy suit carrying a sleek leather folder. He took a seat in the chair opposite my desk and tossed the folder onto the polished wood. "Good morning, Skylar," Andre said, a familiar, triumphant smile spreading across his face. "I have the final piece of paperwork for you. The Federal Historic Preservation Trust has officially cleared all the fraudulent liens from the upstate property. The sting operation is closed and the asset is ready to be transferred." I opened the folder. Inside was a pristine, legally binding property deed. When Andre and I originally transferred the house to the trust, we included a highly specific legal loophole. It was a reversion clause that allowed the original owner to repurchase the historic property once it was no longer required as federal evidence. I picked up my favorite fountain pen. I looked at the purchase price listed on the bottom of the document. "Are they really honoring the agreed-upon price?" I asked, unable to hide my amusement. Andre chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "A signed contract is a signed contract, Skylar. The federal government has no interest in maintaining a residential property in upstate New York. They got their high-profile arrest, and you get your grandmother's house back." I uncapped my pen and signed my name on the dotted line, officially reclaiming the only piece of my family history that actually mattered to me. I reached into my desk drawer, pulled out my wallet, and extracted a single crisp $1 bill. I slid the dollar across the desk toward Andre. "Keep the change," I said. Andre picked up the dollar bill, folded it neatly, and placed it in his pocket. "It has been an absolute pleasure doing business with you, partner." He stood up, gave me a respectful nod, and walked out of the office to prepare for our morning staff meeting. I plan to restore the upstate house exactly the way my grandmother kept it. It will not be a bargaining chip or a desperate source of cash. It will be a sanctuary. I walked back over to the expansive windows and looked down at the bustling city below. For my entire life, my family had mistaken my quiet independence for weakness. They thought my refusal to play their toxic games meant I was naive. They assumed that because I did not demand the spotlight, I would simply roll over and let them take whatever they wanted. They thought my independence made me an easy target. They didn't realize it made me untouchable. If you have ever had to walk away from the people who were supposed to protect you, I want you to know that your value is not defined by their inability to see it. Have you ever turned a massive betrayal into your greatest victory? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more stories of resilience, boundaries, and ultimate vindication. Thank you for listening, and remember, the best revenge is always building a life where your enemies no longer exist. The Power of Unshakable Boundaries. The Saga of Skylar, Brandon, and Beatrice offers a masterclass in navigating toxic familial entitlement. The most profound lesson embedded in this story is that true power does not roar. It observes, prepares, and protects itself through unshakable independence and ironclad boundaries. Brandon and Beatrice operated under the illusion that volume, social manipulation, and entitlement equated to control. They mistook Skylar's quiet nature and self-sufficiency for weakness, assuming her lack of participation in their toxic games meant she was an easy target. However, Skylar demonstrated that genuine strength lies in emotional detachment and meticulous preparation. By severing her emotional reliance on a family that only viewed her as a financial resource, she effectively removed their primary weapon of manipulation: guilt. Furthermore, the story highlights a candid reality about toxic individuals. You rarely need to seek active revenge against them. Their own unchecked greed, entitlement, and arrogance will eventually dismantle their lives. Skylar didn't force Brandon to steal, gamble, or forge federal documents. She simply stopped shielding him from the consequences of his own actions and let reality take its natural, devastating course. Her financial and professional independence was her fortress, allowing her to watch the collapse safely from the outside, rather than being pulled down into the inevitable wreckage. Ultimately, this narrative serves as a stark reminder that we are never obligated to set ourselves on fire just to keep destructive family members warm. Protect your peace, secure your independence, And never let anyone guilt you into compromising your own hard-earned stability. Take a moment today to evaluate your own boundaries and take one concrete step toward securing your emotional and financial independence.